Welcome to the Misophonia podcast. This is season 7, episode 1. My name's Adil Ahmad, and I have Misophonia. I'm so excited to begin this new batch of interviews this season. The seasons are somewhat arbitrary. It's basically a bunch of interviews that are recorded at once and then released throughout the year. I'm hoping to do some interesting things this time, like have interviews in different languages, but we'll see. Today's episode is with Elaine, an educator and reading tutor. I believe in the New York State area. I actually forgot now. But anyway, this is a fascinating interview. She just found out about the podcast recently and was inspired by the Lisa Loeb episode to talk to her daughter about misophonia, because Elaine's daughter also has it. And in fact, it seems to run in her family. We talk about the family connections. We talk about her mother, who was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which had a major impact on Elaine growing up and right up to the time she passed. We talk about explaining miso to her husband, being triggered by some voices and consonant sounds, being triggered by pets, being an HSP, highly sensitive person, that comes up a lot, how she told her therapist, and finally, at the end, she recites a beautiful poem she wrote about, you guessed it, misophonia. After the show, do let me know what you think. You can reach out by email at hello@misophoniapodcast.com or hit me up on Instagram or Facebook at Misophonia Podcast. And do head over, leave a quick rating or review wherever you listen to this show. It helps drive us up in the algorithms. Thanks, as always, for the incredible ongoing support of our Patreon supporters. If you feel like contributing financially, you can read all about the various levels at patreon.com/misophoniapodcast. All right, kicking off this season, here's my conversation with Elaine. Elaine, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited. A little bit nervous too, but very excited.
Oh yeah, no, it flies by, and yeah, it shouldn't be any reason to be nervous. But yeah, do you want to start off by just telling us kind of like where you are, what you do?
Yeah, definitely. So I am in upstate New York, and I am a reading tutor. So I was a reading teacher and a special education tutor. And in 2020, as most of our lives were changed, so was mine. And I was offered a position to work with someone who specializes with students with dyslexia. I'm working with them. So that's kind of where I went. So I quit my full-time reading job, and then I've been doing it ever since. And now I'm also into training other teachers. So it's very exciting. And yeah, that's right.
And is it all virtual?
Nope. Some of it's virtual and some of it's in person. So I have students locally that I see, but then yes, a lot of it is virtually, which is so amazing because I work with a student in Switzerland. I work with students in Canada. So, just kids and families I would never meet otherwise. So it's pretty neat. The virtual.
Yeah. And great. And I guess maybe maybe we can just kind of get into a little bit of your kind of we should obviously talk about the poem you wrote, which is very beautiful. But I guess life right now for you, obviously things changed for a lot of us over the past few years for you, job wise. How's life for you kind of sonically, I guess?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was thinking so much about the podcast and everyone's experiences, and mine are very similar to a lot of them that I've listened to. So really, it's just, since I was a little kid, just lots of sounds kind of just, invoke that kind of, like we talk about the fight and flight.
Fight or flight, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So kind of reflecting back, thinking about my mother and her parents, particularly her dad, just things she said to me, and then actually my own daughter as well. So I definitely am a believer of the genetic component to this. So it's definitely affected my life in so many different ways. And it's just been a beautiful thing to listen to this podcast. I just have to tell you that. So a little background too I wanted to give you in terms of how I found you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I was on Instagram, and an ad came up for some earplugs, and I was looking at them for my daughter actually, and bought them for her. And after I bought them, it said like, "Oh, check out these other things," and so your podcast was one of the things to check out. So when I checked it out, the most recent one was the Lisa Loeb interview.
Yeah, yeah,
And literally, I just cried through the whole thing because I was like, oh my gosh, here's this person who has, this experience and also is dealing with it with children. And
yeah.
it just really impacted me. And it was just such a beautiful thing to listen to. And the whole time I was like, oh my gosh, me too, me too.
Yeah, it's
And
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, isn't it? So then I was just determined to listen to every single episode. So I started back at the beginning of the very,
It
season
was
one.
Giselle. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then I was like, okay, I was doing the math in my head. I was like, okay, to get through all, because my drive to my office is only about 20 minutes. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
to get through every single episode,
Get a 2x it. Yeah.
yeah, it's gonna take a while. So then I started kind of going back and forth between an old one and a new one, and an old one and a new one. So yeah, it's been just really fascinating listening to everything. But yeah,
Yeah, no, there's some great ones. That yeah, the Lisa Loeb. That's interesting because yeah, obviously, like it affects her family 24/7. You never kind of necessarily realize it watching her, her career and her Instagram and whatnot. But
yeah,
it just goes to tell you that you just never know what's going on behind the scenes.
exactly.
Which yeah, I don't need to like necessarily know which earplugs, but w- was it in the packaging that it mentioned the podcast, or on their website,
It was
or
on their website. Yeah, I think
okay,
it's like called like Loop, maybe Loop
right,
one.
right, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, those ones. And so
Oh,
that's why.
interesting that they mention it because I haven't been particularly generous about their performance, but um, anyways,
Yeah.
okay, cool. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, for a lot of us, there is kind of a familial trace, whether it's direct or uncles or cousins have it. The jury's strange. The jury's still out necessarily on like the DNA genetics, but there's the idea of the epigenetics where, um, traits can be passed on through markers that are placed on the genes that are
Oh, okay.
created by environmental factors.
Oh,
And so
wow.
it's not changing necessarily the DNA, but it's changing how the DNA is expressed. And so um, these markers are created based on an environmental stress or something that happens, which can basically turn on or off parts of the DNA. And so as you develop, you could be more likely to maybe possibly to develop something like misophonia if your environment kind of like influences that.
Oh, wow.
I'm not a scientist, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's there's I didn't realize that there were different factors at play in terms of
Yeah.
genetics. But actually, I am curious. Going back to you said your mom's parents were there signs that your grandparents were sensitive to sound?
Yeah, so my mom would tell me stories about her dad. She told me that her dad had quite a temper on him, and which is a side that I never saw.
Mm,
But she said when she was a little girl, he would kind of go crazy if the washing machine was on, or he would get really upset if her mother was vacuuming. And
mm,
just those little things that, like, at the time, I didn't know what misophonia was or that it was a thing. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting that, those two particular things made
yeah.
him, like, really upset. And then for my mom, so my mom was also diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
So, like paranoid schizophrenia. So, the beginning of my poem is actually about her because
Ah.
she would say things like that. Like, she would say, my mind attracted the crows, and like a crow cawing was one of her triggers. And, as a child, I was kind of like, well, that doesn't make sense. That can't be true. So, I always thought I was related to her mental illness. And then just reflecting on misophonia, I was like, oh, I wonder how much of her strife, I mean, she was just so troubled, and I just wonder how
Mm-hmm.
much of it was the misophonia, too, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of that sensitivity of. But I think her illness though took it a step further in terms of she felt like she was creating like it was her will was creating these situations, if that makes sense. So like things like that, like a cricket, like she would say, if there were a million crickets outside my window, it wouldn't bother me, but there's always just the one, there's just one cricket making the noise and I can't sleep, but she gets so
Mm.
upset. And so yeah, she just had, like I said, like we all have different triggers, her triggers, but she also, I guess, internalized it in terms of that she was causing it to happen. So different, obviously different than,
Oh,
um,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Did you talk to her about misophonia?
I
Yeah.
didn't know she
Yeah.
passed away in 2020, and
Mm-hmm.
um, I really didn't talk to anybody, and I guess that's part of a little bit of my nervousness for today is
Mm-hmm.
just talking about it. I don't talk openly about it, and I
Mm-hmm.
think when I try to figure out why. I think it's because there's that, to me, there's almost like the shame, but also the fear that if people knew like how um I don't know how to explain it, but like almost how violent it seems to me of a
Mm-hmm.
reaction, that they would judge me as being someone who is a violent person, which I am not. So,
Right.
I think that's a big part of it too. So for my mom, I didn't really talk to her much about it because she was so sensitive about it too, and emotional, and she was very erratic. And, my childhood was pretty traumatic with her. So, I didn't really bring it up with her. But now that she's passed, I think a lot of, I just reflect a lot about her life and my life with her, and how this definitely, I believe impacted her, and she didn't even know about it, so.
Was so her childhood when her dad was, had a temper. What decade around would that have been? The 30s, 40s?
Yes, she was born in 1946. So,
Okay, okay.
yeah, so like maybe 50s, 60s, she was reflecting on her childhood. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. And then would you say with that temper of her dad, like was her childhood maybe a little bit rough
I'm
as
I'm
well?
assuming,
Yeah.
she actually, I didn't even meet her parents until I lived with my dad and my stepmother because my parents are divorced, and
Mm-hmm.
because she didn't want her parents to be in my life because of her
Mm-hmm.
childhood. So yes, I'm
Mm-hmm.
assuming it was.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Right. No, I mean, yeah, I'm sure you've probably heard enough episodes to know that there's often some, yeah, it's some difficulty growing up that it kind of accompanies misophonia. And one
Yeah,
wonders, I often wonder, like, is is the sensitivity to hearing something that your child self develops to maybe warn you of impending danger.
yeah,
Uh, and then this danger where when you're an adult, you don't necessarily need it at that
right.
at that kind of level, but it's something that your body remembers and it just cannot shake off.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
When you've talked about that in previous podcasts, I've definitely thought about that. That totally makes sense because my mother's behavior was so erratic
hmm
that I used to hide from her, and
hmm
also, I remember as a child, yeah, like it's coming home from school being like, okay, like you got to check the environment, like, is
Yeah.
this a safe environment? How is she feeling? How is she doing? What is she thinking? So yeah, that totally makes sense about that. Yeah.
Where did you hide? Like in your room?
Interestingly, we used to have this big, like almost like a lazy boy kind of rocker chair, and the back of it, I remember it was like ripped. I used to hide inside that chair. Like I
Oh my
would
God.
climb inside it, like with all the coils, Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that was like
Wow.
my hiding space when I was little. Because she never could find me in there. So, uh,
That's okay. Wow. That's amazing. And I was gonna actually, I was gonna ask, have you heard you said you're going back and forth, you might be interested in the Eric episode. I don't know if you heard that from, I think it was earlier this season, but he also had a mother, I believe it's schizophrenia, and she would take different personalities at night
oh wow,
sometimes, and it would um, obviously he's got misophonia, but I think a lot of it was, yeah, as a child, having to listen for, you know, there would maybe be like a plate breaking or something in the middle of the night
Yeah.
that would have been thrown. So, you know, these kinds of experiences do happen, and and so you might hear some interesting parallels in that. But
Yeah, yeah, definitely check that one out too. Like my plan is to listen to all of them, so I'm sure
yeah,
I'll get to his.
yeah, yeah. Okay, and I guess, yeah, maybe sticking with childhood. What was like, you know, obviously, other than hiding inside lazy boys, were you starting to get the typical triggers, like eating sounds, like dinner table kind of sounds, and how were you reacting other
Yeah,
than obviously
so
hiding in lazy boys?
So yeah, when I actually first started noticing it was when I left my mom's and I moved in with my dad
Mm,
and my stepmother, and it was, probably age like 10 or 11, and it was definitely more around our pets, which is interesting. Our cats, so like a cat, bathing itself would just drive me nuts, and the cat like lapping up water, the cat chewing, and it was just so hard for me because I am such an animal lover. I just love animals. I've had, rescued pets my whole life. And to be so angered by a sound by this little innocent creature was just very confusing to me. And frustrating too, because it's like, why would, why would this bother me? And then it kind of gradually went into, the chewing thing, yes, like dinner time, chewing, that kind of thing. And then as I've gotten older, and just again, similarly to a lot of the podcasts, it's just like the triggers have just grown exponentially, just to things that didn't bother me before, like, certain voices, certain, like, how sounds are like, or their syllables are like accentuated right through
mm-hmm.
voices, and then like, clicking and tapping, and again, it's interesting. It's like I feel like as soon as my brain notices the sound, then I'm done for. Because then it's
Yeah.
like, and like in my poem that I wrote, it's like it almost to me feels like it's seeking that sound and it's seeking the repetition.
Yeah, I think you used the word hunting, brain hunting for
Yeah.
sounds or seeking. Yeah, yeah.
And that's how it feels. I mean, like at my office, there's a beautiful bed and breakfast right next to it, and so there's a lot of lawn maintenance that happens at this bed and breakfast,
Mm-hmm.
and like the leaf blower. I mean, it's the leaf blowing for hours on end, and it's like and before, like, a leaf blower didn't bother me, but it's like I don't know, it's whatever noise is kind of interrupting or distracting me from what I'm trying to focus on, then that becomes the noise that I cannot
Yeah.
stand. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not part of your prefrontal conscious. It's something more reptilian
Yeah.
inside of us, that is reacting. That's possibly trying to warn you of a danger that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And how does it affect? Obviously, you know, your career choices. You obviously have to listen to exactly how people are, reading, and
Yeah.
how's it affected that,
It's
or has it affected
It
that?
is, yeah, it's interesting to me too. This, like, it's almost like a selectivity. So, with my own children, I have two children, and with the students that I work with, I feel like I have such a deep love for them that it's
Mm,
almost like my brain excuses them. Like, it makes them
yeah.
the exception to the rule. I don't know. I mean, sometimes the kids I work with, it's after school, so they're snacking. So sometimes that can be kind of like, oh man, I wish they weren't, chewing
Yeah.
while we're trying to read, because it doesn't really work anyways, chewing and reading. But yeah, I feel like I can handle that better than a stranger. I don't know, just because I think it's just because I care so much about, and I'm so hyper focused too, like with the tutoring. So, like I said, most of my students have the same kind of story in that they didn't get the kind of help they needed in their
Mm,
school, and so they're behind, and their self esteem is really low. And so I don't
mm,
know, I just have a lot of compassion for these. children. And so I feel like I'm so hyper focused on having them make progress and feel good about themselves that I don't know, the sounds for some reason don't bother me as much. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. I think that's kind of beautiful on many levels because that you're able to your brain that is so wired to be on edge can make space for that. And also, I think a lot of people come on somehow. Yeah, some of the brain assigns the a non-threat label on kids
Yeah.
because if this is in fact um, a basically a warning, trying to something your body trying to warn you, then children are your brain can is able to understand that you're not under threat
Yeah.
in the
That makes
situation, and maybe that makes some space for that as
Yeah.
well. Um, what about like the teachers you train? Do you find in your workspace, in kind of your work environment now that there's your teachers can the teachers that you teach can kind of trigger you?
Yeah, just sometimes again, like the
Yeah,
voice thing. There's some
right.
voices like, for some reason if like a female voice that like holds out the S sound like longer
Yeah.
than any other sound. I don't know, like
Mm-hmm.
that can be like, oh my gosh, why? Or maybe
Mm-hmm.
like a voice that's kind of more nasalized or something. I don't know, and that kind of another thing that reminds me of is what I was thinking about too in terms of misophonia is how it's like there's two extremes too though to sounds. So like
Mm-hmm.
there's the sounds that you can't stand, but then there's the sounds that you love. So like
Mm-hmm.
there's certain voices that I just love, like and it's like, oh, that's such a calm voice, or I don't know, just there's certain voices that are like, oh, I like that voice, so
Right.
I don't know. It's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah, no, that comes up where there's people have found kind of like or are able to identify the sounds that they really like. And I think there's some research going into um maybe in real having a device that in real time modifies sounds or masks sounds with something that you like as a way of potentially coping with
Coping. Yeah.
life. What are some of your coping methods as you go about your life?
Yeah, I feel like I don't have too many just because
Hmm.
it's more of a hidden thing, I guess, because I
Yeah.
don't want to, inconvenience other people. But I mean, I
Hmm.
definitely would say, exercise is helpful if I'm able to,
Hmm.
So like if I'm on, sometimes I'm doing teacher observations, like video observations that I can pause. So like,
Hmm.
let's say I'm in the office and like the leaf blower is like, all right, I cannot listen to one more, you know,
Hmm.
ring.
Yeah.
Then I will just go. I will stop. I'll pause, and I'll just go for a walk. So I guess getting away is definitely helpful to get out of the situation. Or if the pets, for example, if the cat decides that he wants to take a bath right in front of me, I'll just
Right.
leave the room if I can. So that kind of a thing. And I know, like you said in a lot of episodes, people talk about like mimicking sounds.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes if I can like hum or something, that's helpful to kind of hum through the sound.
Mm.
Um, that'll work. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's more. I've always been the kind of person that keeps everything kind of buried and keeps everything in. So
Hmm.
it's more of just internal brewing, I think,
Well,
than
I mean, it sounds like you've
hoping.
experienced you sound like you've experienced a lot of stuff growing up that most people, I mean, would not understand. So,
Yeah.
maybe that's I don't know. I'm just speculating. Yeah, it's tough to kind of explain some of this stuff to other people. And misophonia definitely is hard to explain. Have you tried to talk to other people? Because a lot of us, we get shut down a lot, and so after a while, we just get tired of even trying to explain it.
Right. Yeah, well, it's interesting. So for my husband, I've tried to explain it to him, and also because my daughter, I'm
Right.
100% sure that she has this, and to try to explain what she's going through so he can have a perspective. And he's very quiet when I explain it.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of take that as he just doesn't get it. He just doesn't
Mm-hmm.
understand. You know, because even like, again, the episodes talk about just visual triggers. So like even if
Yeah.
like the cat, let's say like the cat is on the bed and licking itself, but there's like a TV show going on, so you can't even hear it. I still cannot. I still have to like remove the cat, like pick the cat. And he's like, how can that bother you? You can't even hear it. Like, and it's like
Yeah.
trying to explain it to him. He just doesn't
Everyone
understand.
listening understands, but
Yeah.
yeah. And
So
so, how did yeah, I'm curious if when your daughter started to um express misophonia, did you talk to her about it right away? I mean, how did you approach that?
yeah. So it's funny. So when I listened to your podcast, the Lisa Loeb one, I said to her, "You've got to listen to this with me." So when she was in the car, like I was
How old is
pumped
she?
for her. So she's 12. She'll be
Okay.
13.
Okay.
Yeah, in July. And I was like, this is what's going on. Like I was just so excited and just
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just so happy that this podcast exists. Honestly, you have no idea. And so I wanted to share it with her, and I don't know, preteen kind of
Mm-hmm.
typical response, like, okay, whatever, like
Yeah.
not that big of a deal to her. But it's interesting, because she has recently talked to me about she has a social studies class and there's like a teacher assistant in there, and she said to me something like, I can't deal, like I literally cannot focus because this woman sits next to her and breathes really heavily, so that's one of her triggers is breathing. And
Mm-hmm.
she's like, I just can't. She's like, it's the whole period I have no idea what's going on in my class because all I
Mm.
can hear is this woman breathing and I can't take it. And so we've talked about, me talking to her guidance counselor and trying to explain to the guidance counselor what misophonia is. And again, like you're saying, a lot of people just don't get it, and um, so I've contemplated because is it Marcia, is it
Marsha
Johnson?
Johnson. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I called there to see if I could make like a consult appointment for her to see if perhaps I could get an official diagnosis so then she could have a 504. So these people know, like, I'm not just like this annoying mom
Mm-hmm.
that's like complaining, because it's more than that. But at the same time, I feel like if I had it from a doctor instead of just a mom, maybe they would take it more seriously. So,
Mm-hmm.
so anyway, so we're thinking about doing that. It's just tricky because of health insurance and all that different state and
Right.
all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, so I would say probably within the past, year or two, I've really noticed it with her with a lot of sounds. Like she doesn't like coughing, um,
Mm-hmm.
you
Throat
know,
clearing,
yeah,
maybe.
throat clearing. And the breathing thing is definitely a big one because she has a little brother who's always congested. He has allergies. And,
Mm.
we'll be in the car and she'll be like, stop breathing.
Yeah.
It's like he can't not breathe. So what are we going to, how can we help, So that's when I was looking into those earplugs and then,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of where that came from. But,
Does she wear headphones a lot?
so yeah, so now
Yeah.
she has, I'm someone who's very cautious when it comes to technology just because
Yeah.
of all of the research out there with teens and screens and
Yep.
yeah, and also our family just has a history of mental health concerns like
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, so I was really resistant to getting her a phone. I really did not want to get her
No,
one.
just you don't have to give her a phone. Just give her an old Walkman from
Yeah.
1983. Yeah.
Well, we ended up getting her one. We got her the Bark phone. I don't know if you've heard of the Bark phone, but we did get
Uh-huh.
her that. It's very, so you can monitor it a lot. But
Yeah.
so yeah, so now that's her go-to is having that with headphones. Yeah, so she had in the car, so that's great. She can always put her headphones in with that. So
And growing up, did she I'm curious, did she observe your reaction? Like
you know,
was there
that's so funny that you asked that because, to be honest with you, I think that my husband's point of view is that I created this. And I don't think he realizes how hurtful that is by saying something like that. But
right, right.
he did say, um, when she was little, because she would kind of shush the pets too. Like if the pet was
Mm-hmm.
licking or chewing, and she would be like, Momo, stop, like we had our dog, Momo. And he was just like, oh great, now you've made it so that she's going to be like this, and for a while I did feel a bit like questioning myself, like did I, like through modeling, like cause this? But then it's like, okay, no, I don't I don't think that you can cause a disorder to another person, obviously, but I'm sure I didn't help the situation by doing that in front of her.
Right, I wasn't trying to right, I definitely don't wanna suggest that it's, yeah, that anybody causes it
Yeah,
for
yeah,
somebody else, but, I'm, just thinking about, obviously, it sounds like you don't have the temper of your grandfather, but I'm just curious, sometimes we just observe or kids can observe things and maybe, I don't know, interpret things their own way,
yeah.
and I don't know, one thing could lead to another, not but, yeah, it's not like you were throwing plates around and stuff, so, like
No, no,
like
no,
other
no.
stories,
Yeah.
and, that could really, cause fear, but,
Yeah, she
uh,
definitely just witnessed me more being, like,
yeah.
okay, I need to remove myself or the animal needs to
Mhm.
be removed. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
Okay, and then, yeah, I mean, I guess, actually, going back to, you know, the most therapists and doctors, yeah, a lot of people just don't get it. Do you feel like, are they, it's easy to say that people just don't get it. I'm just curious if they are, thinking that it's part of something else, like anxiety or OCD or something like that. That seems to be what a lot of people just assume that it is, and they just assume that,
yeah.
oh, just use one of those tricks or techniques to kind of get over it or snap out of it. Do you ever get that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with therapists since 2013, the same
Mm,
therapist the whole time, which is great, and she's wonderful, and she's to me, she's almost like a mother figure to me because she's a little bit younger than my mom,
mm,
would be right now, and because my mom and I did not have a good relationship, and my stepmother and I did not either. Like I really
mm,
didn't have a strong, mother figure in my life. But yeah, so she has worked with me for a long time and around like more of anxiety and depression and understanding, my behavior as an adult based off of my childhood experiences and kind of my go-to reaction of everything being like I did something wrong or it's my fault for
yeah.
something because of just growing up with a mom who was just so erratic
Mm-hmm.
and not supportive and so yeah so I've definitely been working on that and so with the misophonia it's like you would think that being that close to somebody for so long as a therapist, like that would be like one of the main things that we've talked about, but it honestly hasn't. I think it's because I guess there's so many bigger issues, I guess, going
Yeah,
on that
yeah.
we've focused on. And
Uh-huh.
so, but I did mention it to her because again, like this podcast, I feel like is so freeing to me as well
Mm-hmm.
because it's something that I feel like I've hidden for so long and that all these people are being open about it and talking about their
That's the
experience.
whole point of it. That's the whole point of why
Yeah,
I do this. Because I think
yeah,
most of us feel like this is the dumb, stupid thing that I should not be worried about.
yeah,
But it's actually just as important, and can point to the things going back that you experienced growing up and that your family experienced in previous generations. And
yeah.
so,
So, yeah, and I think part of it too for me was almost like it's to me, it's like a scary thing as well, like
mm,
the rage part, like, because it's like
yeah,
again, I'm just such a calm, like, chill, easygoing person, but yet when some of these sounds happen, I just feel like it's, like, almost like the Incredible Hulk or something, like, it turning into
hmm,
something that's just so angry and enraged that to the point of, like, violent kind of images will come in my head about ending that sound, but
hmm,
that's not who I am as a person. So I guess that's why it's been really hard for me to talk to people about it because I think without understanding it or having the perspective of it, someone could possibly be like, wow, this is like a really violent person who's a
yeah,
danger and maybe perhaps shouldn't have children or shouldn't have
hmm,
pets because they're so have these horrible ideas, based on
hmm,
sound. And so for to me, that part is just kind of frightening, I guess, in terms of that judgment piece for people to openly talk to them about it. But again, like listening to the podcast has been so wonderful because I can tell just listening to every person's story that they're just kind souls. All these people are just wonderful, kind people who aren't violent, right? Like who aren't like people that would do anything horrible, but yet this trigger is something that just can create this feeling, that's just so
Mm-hmm.
overpowering. But anyways, so I guess that's another piece of not talking to many people about it, even the therapist, because when I did mention it to her, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not that familiar with that," and that's, I'm glad she's being honest and not saying, "Oh, I know all about that, and let's just fix it this way." So,
Right, right.
but yeah, so
What kind of for the other? I'm just curious. What kind of therapies modalities does she use for some of these other more
yeah, so
traditional things?
most of it's kind of just that behavioral,
Mm-hmm.
cognitive therapy in terms of trying to change your thinking patterns,
Right, right.
when you get into a situation, because again, a lot of my initial reaction to things is I'm doing something wrong, I've upset this person, or I've caused this problem and I need to fix it. And it's,
Mm-hmm.
it's always based on me versus, changing my perspective of, okay, what are the alternatives here? Like, what else
Right.
could be happening in this situation? So you don't turn it, inward again.
Spiral. Yeah.
Yeah.
Has that helped? Yeah, I mean, sounds like it's been pretty effective because you're still you're still um, seeing this therapist, and it seems to be for a reason you haven't left the therapist. So I'm assuming there's some progress there
Yeah, definitely.
for the non misophonia stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. When I get into situations, at least now I can stop,
Yeah.
myself and say, okay, like if her name is Chris, I'm like, if Chris was in this situation, what would
Mm,
she say to you? Like, okay,
mm-hmm.
let's stop and think, and what's the alternative here, and how can I frame this differently? So yeah, it's definitely helped, but there's a way, long ways to go. But,
Yeah, and is there any is has she has there been any kind of looking back at trying to process or reprocess the past in any way? Like
oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
it's our two biggest topics is
Mhm.
my mom and growing up with her. And she always brings it back to like, okay, well, why do you think you're reacting this way? Okay. Right. Because it has to do with, X, Y, and Z in your childhood. And then same thing for my relationship with my own daughter, because
Mhm.
that's our probably second biggest topic, is because, I don't want to have that kind of relationship with her that I had with my own mom, right? Like it's
Mhm.
so important to me to have a good relationship with her that I think I take things too hard or too sensitive about certain things. And the eggshell thing too is tough for me.
Walking on eggshells.
Yeah, because I know like things that bother her, so then I get like anxious about bothering her. So it's like almost
Mhm.
like this, I don't know, this just like hamster wheel of like for example, like I know yawning really bothers her, and she'll say things to me like, "Oh, that's like the worst sound I've ever heard in my life is you yawning." And for me, if I get nervous, I yawn
Mhm.
a lot. So, like, which is interesting, and I've looked that up, and that actually is like it's not just me. Like, that's an actual like coping mechanism for anxiety. Your body will yawn, which I was like, okay, so it's like not
Interesting.
just me. Yeah. So then it's like, okay, so I'm on eggshells that I'm gonna trigger her, and then which causes me to yawn, which causes to trigger. So it's just that's tricky, balancing that. And again, the Lisa Loeb episode was great to listen to hear how it sounds like she's got the same thing going on with her children. Like you have the perspective, you understand, which makes you even more aware of it, I guess. So then you find yourself being even more careful. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. You think, oh, I mean, you would think that you can help, but it's not quite that simple.
Yeah.
There's um, and actually that reminds that brings up a point of the highly sensitive people, HSP. A lot of those folks come on the podcast where people who are just kind of like overall just feel things more intensely,
Yeah.
um, and do you have you heard of that term? Do you kind of identify a little bit with HSP? I'm curious if your other family members as well might be considered HSP.
Yeah, I think oh, definitely, and I think a lot of it has to do with the childhood too,
Mm-hmm.
of just having to read the room because of my
Yeah.
mom,
Yeah.
not knowing if is this a good moment or a bad moment, and so because of that, I'm definitely just I notice things in crowds that nobody else notices, and I find myself getting anxious about situations of strangers, that I can just sense an escalation between two people that has nothing to do with me, and yeah, again, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, oh, I can tell that person's getting upset. Oh no," like, and then
Yeah.
I'm heightened, and it's like, my again, my husband's why, why do you even care? And it's like, well, because he grew up with very stable parents, so he just doesn't
Mm-hmm.
understand. But
That's interesting you mentioned that. I don't know if I mentioned that on a recent episode, but yeah, the idea of like noticing an escalation and part of me is just like, oh my gosh, if I can just jump in and like answer and just like interpret what's happening, then we could
yeah,
not talk past, one another. Interesting. Did you
yeah.
ever, before your mother passed away, did you ever um, come to any kind of understanding or reconcile or just kind of like be at peace with your childhood?
Yeah, not that's a very interesting question. So, several years before she passed, I decided to break off communication with her
Mm,
because she was very verbally abusive to
ooh,
me. Still, even into my adulthood, she would um, just scream. I mean, she just was a screamer, and she would just get so upset about things, and just say very hurtful things to me. Like, for example, she with the paranoia part, like she and I had gone to like a church thing, together, and then afterwards she was convinced that the pastor sermon was all about her. Like it was the whole thing was written just for her, and that he was
mm,
talking just to her. And we were talking in the car about it, and she asked me what I thought. And I said, no, I don't think so. I think, blah, blah, blah. And she said something to me like, well, then your conscience must be dead or something. She would just say things
mm,
to me like that. And,
yeah.
but then later on, if I would bring up something like that to try to talk to her about it, like after the fact, she would be like, oh, I would have never said something like that to you. So you could never,
So it was, so she would be, it sounds like there would be episodes. She'd going through episodes where she would like talk for abusive, um, but a lot of the time it wasn't the case. Like she was pretty normal
she would know, like
or,
she would recall it differently. So yeah,
oh,
it's like,
yeah,
I think it's like maybe I don't know, like mania, maybe where like
yeah, yeah.
just you just don't even remember it, or like she would just get so upset and she'd be very violent and and then she would act like nothing ever happened. So I think,
Mm,
yeah, so it's like you can't really reconcile with someone who
mm,
views the past differently than it actually happened.
gotcha. Yeah,
So
yeah.
so yeah, but then, when she went into cardiac arrest and she was on life support for a while, and I talked to my brothers and I said, I really want to go see her, and so when I did, and she came off of life support actually, and when she saw me, it was like almost something uncanny. It's hard to explain, but it was like she had forgotten everything. It's like she had forgotten any kind of strife between us. And
Mm-hmm.
she was so loving and so caring and so happy to see me that I couldn't believe it. It was like a gift, really. So for her, it was about 2 months before she passed away that I was visiting her every week, and just talking with her and checking in on her, and telling her that I loved her, and yeah, and she was just so kind and
For the
happy to
whole
see me
last two
for
months.
the whole, yeah. And so when I
Wow.
talked to my own therapist about it, she said there is this kind of phenomenon about people with mental illness towards death, that it's almost like it's I don't know how she explained it, but almost like it's like a lapse of mental illness close to death. It's very interesting. So she's just wondering if that was part of it. I don't know. But
That's
to me it was,
fascinating.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
really like a miracle, because so now I got a few months with her at the very end,
Mm-hmm.
where it just was very loving, and yeah.
Was
Um,
that overall? I don't, not to dwell on too much, but was that? Did you come away from that feeling? good about it, or just feeling like, oh, why couldn't I have had those 2 months for my whole life kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, just like the stages of grief, you go through different
yeah.
things. And so I felt like I was grieving multiple things, and the therapist told me that too. It's like you're grieving your mother passing, but you're also grieving not having a mother, like when you were a
Hmm.
child, right? Like you're not having a typical mother-daughter relationship. So it's like, and then I was also grieving that I wish that could have continued, the last couple of months. And like, why, like
Oh,
you're saying,
right.
why couldn't we just continue to have this good of a relationship? So yeah, it was,
And
yeah. Sorry.
yeah, speaking of grief, there is people have mentioned the idea of misophonia grief, which is the grief of missing out on events due to running away from sounds and whatnot.
Yeah. Oh,
Which
definitely.
I mean, probably continues for a lot of us living, especially if we have kids and whatnot. Like, what are we missing out on in terms of family functions and things like that? Um,
Yeah.
I'm curious. Actually, well, you mentioned brothers. I'm curious if any of your siblings developed any kind of sensitivities, or did they notice yours growing up?
Yeah, so that's interesting too. So my brother Joe, we're only 2 years apart. So he's my closest brother. All my other brothers are older, significantly older than me. But he's the one who actually called me up one day, and when the documentary came out, and it was so funny. He was saying to me, he goes, I was just watched this show about people and how they have like a physical reaction to a sound. Like he's like, could you imagine having like a physical reaction to a sound? And I was like, yeah. And then after I got off the phone with him, I was like, kind of like, okay, was that his like odd way of being like, I think you have this and you should watch this, but I'm not going to tell
Yeah,
you I think you have this.
yeah,
So, by just acting surprised that this exists. So that's how I first even
yeah.
knew it was a
Was that
thing.
the 2020 documentary or?
No, I feel like it was earlier than
Okay.
that. So maybe it wasn't necessarily a documentary, but just
Hmm.
about people who were experiencing that. So
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly when it was, but yeah, it was. So I started to watch it, but I couldn't finish it because it was just so depressing and just I don't know, it's just so hard. And I guess like you're talking about the miso grief, sometimes I do find myself kind of getting into a dark place of I don't know, like feeling like I'm cursed, like I try to stay
Yeah,
positive,
yeah.
but yeah, like why do I have to have this? It's so
Right.
tough. But, anyway,
Yeah, yeah. That documentary. Maybe is it the movie, like Quiet Please documentary? That
I'm not sure. Yeah, I
okay,
don't
okay, yeah,
remember.
yeah. No, because I don't want to dwell on it, just because yeah, that one in particular, I think it's about an hour and a half, and yeah, and I could not sit through it. Like, it took me several viewings to kind of finish it because yeah, it does. It's just so emotional,
Yeah,
and that was before I started the podcast. So just listening to somebody talk about it was just very, very heavy. Um, so I totally get that. Um, but and so these your siblings, these were from your natural mom. Were they
yeah,
all experiencing the same? Like, they were all witnessing the same uh, kind of chaos that you were.
yeah. They were, and actually, we have a kind of a unique situation in our family as well. That my middle brother was actually adopted out of our family, and I didn't meet him until I was
Mm,
17. And because my mom couldn't handle him, so he had
mm,
like severe ADHD, and she just could not raise him. And
mm,
she was
mm,
very physically abusive to him, and
mm,
eventually was like, he has to go. And so he ended up being in foster care and being adopted. And yeah, so honestly, I always tell him it's a miracle, and kudos to him for being a functioning adult, because he
yeah.
got the worst of our mother, and then not
Hmm,
only
hmm.
that, but then got taken away. And so yeah, so they all, yeah, I don't know, it's in my two oldest brothers, they say that she was fine up until like the time around I was born, which was not a great thing to tell
Okay.
a child. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, from talking to the therapist, she was talking about how like schizophrenia, a lot of times it kind of the onset can be like early 30s. So I think for my oldest brothers, they, you know, were with her for their childhood during her good years, I guess you could say, before the onset. So
How do they know? I mean, it sounds like you hide things, but I'm curious if they know about your misophonia.
no, they
Mm.
don't. No, but I don't really, um, yeah,
Hmm.
talk about it with
Yeah, yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious. So, then your so I guess so is your husband a trigger to yourself and your child?
Um, yeah, sometimes he
Yeah.
is, more to my daughter than to me, she'd be like,
Right.
if he like burps or something, she's just like, oh my God, it's like the end of the world.
Right.
She just gets upset. But yeah, but not so much for me, I don't think. No. But definitely the dad, which is interesting, so when my stepmother passed away, which was a year before my mother passed away, my dad just went into like a depression because it was really hard for him. He doesn't like to live alone. So we ended up selling our
Hmm.
house and moving into my childhood home with him so that he has company. And it's just interesting because now like we try to have the family meal, which is hard, but he's definitely like I like a trigger for me, like him eating over anybody else. So I'm so curious about that as well because it seems like that's um, common, like the dad. Like I wonder why, but yeah,
Yeah. No, that's. I wonder. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess. Yeah. Dads generally probably if it's between the dad and the mom, they're less like the dad's less likely to care about how they're sounding.
right,
Or maybe that's stereotype, but um, yeah, that's interesting.
yeah,
Needs to be more research on that, but
yeah.
yeah. Have you? I guess have you bumped? I know you've kind of like hidden a lot of stuff, but have you bumped into other people who've mentioned that they have something like this?
Well, not really, except for my daughter. I mean, I did, so the poem that I wrote, which is a tribute to. So I do a lot of like poetry open mic nights, like it's kind of my creative outlet, and do writing workshops. And someone at the writing workshop said, you should, if there's something that's really hard for you to write about, that's what you should be writing about. So that's why I attempted for the poem on misophonia. And when I read it out loud at a poetry, open mic or whatever, the friend that I typically go with, I hadn't really told her about it, but then I read the poem. So of course she was like, well, what's that all about? So I kind of explained it to her, and she said something. She's like, oh, that's interesting. She goes, because she's a teacher as well. And she said, when kids like click their pen, she's like, oh, I have to make them stop. I can't stand when, kids click their pen, but we didn't really get into like in depth, like, okay, there's a difference between like something that's annoying versus something that has that fight or flight where you just feel like you're losing your mind, the difference. But we didn't really get into it too much. But again, I think for me, it's like again, like I talked about before, like that fear of like, I don't want people to think, like, if I try to explain it, like that I'm like a violent person, you know? So that's why I just feel like that's my biggest fear, but
Yeah, yeah, I guess, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, honestly, that's why a lot of us kind of keep things bottled up is that we're all kind of surprised by what we're what goes on in our head.
yeah,
But yeah, no one's ever acted out on stuff. It's that feel like but it's yeah, it's one of the most confusing things. And yeah, I can imagine. I mean, growing up, it's got to be super confusing,
yeah,
um, because yeah, I just don't know how to deal with these thoughts. I guess yeah, yeah, we're coming up to about an hour. I mean, I'm curious,
yeah.
do you want to maybe be cool? Do you want to maybe? I know I'll have links to the poem and whatnot, but would you be up for just kind of reading it?
Sure, yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't have it right in front of me, but I can pull it up
Oh
quickly.
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of put you on the spot, so I'm sorry
No,
about that.
that's okay.
But I think it's so powerful. I loved it because it's not. I mean. there's lots of great poetry, but this was a little bit unusual because it was just kind of written in a more maybe I don't know, a modern format. So
Yeah,
and I think it's interesting, especially as you've kind of like give it some context. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So let's see here. Okay, so there it is. All right. So the misophonia. She said her mind attracted the lone cricket rubbing outside her slightly cracked bedroom window, the black crow cawing from a pine tree branch over her backyard cosmos, the summer fan clicking underneath a whir only detected by her. Like a network of mycelia webbed from her mind to the sound, this pulsing and electromagnetic search and capture escalates. The tendrils lick and embrace with exponential arms and seek out that sound again, inviting even a deadened sound. Just the shapes shifting and repetitive movements will feed the brain's hunt. A bathing cat, a repeating riff, a dripping sink. Each lick, finger pick, and wet ceramic kiss confirms the rage, and the visuals swarm in as the body tries to escape, lacerating, severing, shattering. The misophoniac holds her breath while her hands press each tragus until the cartilage can bend no further, waiting for the images to pass, begging the sounds to fall into a black hole.
yeah, amazing. What? Yeah. What led you to write that?
So again, it was from the person who was doing the workshop and
Oh,
said,
right. Yeah.
yeah, she said, something that would be really hard to write about. That's what you should be writing about. And I thought, well, misophonia is definitely something that will
Yes.
be
Yes.
hard
Yes. Yes.
to write about. Yeah, and it's interesting that reading that poem kind of brings me to also. So my husband is a musician, and he
Mm.
plays in a band that does a lot of time changes, and so he's always practicing, going from time change to time change, right? The measure keeps
Ah.
changing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
he's always practicing. And I love, like I love music, and I love his guitar, and I love to watch him play. But when he's practicing and he does the same thing over and over and over and over,
Mm.
that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to leave. Like
Yeah.
I can't do that, And so anyway, it's like that's just one of those things that was in the poem too. The riff, like just of that guitar, like
Gotcha.
over again. But and it's hard. It's so hard because it's like I love music and I love him and I love to watch him play, and but yet that if he's just practicing something repetitively, like I have to leave. Like I just yeah. So
Yeah.
it's so frustrating that I don't know. But,
Yeah, I know it attacks the things you kind of love the most, which is ultra confusing on
yeah,
another level. Um, yeah, Elaine. I mean, yeah, like I said, we're getting up to an hour. Thanks for reading that. But
yeah.
anything else I guess you wanna share with people who are listening?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you to all the people so far who
Mm,
have done this, and thank you to you for starting it, and to all the future guests.
yeah.
And it's really has been life changing for me, to hear that just other people's experiences, and just all these beautiful people. Like I said, just such kind souls, talking. About something that's like kind of like an open wound, you know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's really, it's to me that's therapeutic. So I just appreciate everyone who's been brave enough to do that too, because I do think there's a part of it that is, being brave at the
Yeah.
same time too, to share. So yeah.
Thank you, Elaine. Glad you found the show and shared so much today. If you like this episode, don't forget to leave a quick review or just hit the 5 stars wherever you listen to this podcast. You can hit me up by email at hello@misophoniapodcast.com or go to the website misophoniapodcast.com. It's even easier to just send a message on Instagram at Misophonia Podcast. You can follow there. Facebook at Misophonia Podcast. On Twitter, it's Misophonia Show. Support the show by visiting the Patreon at patreon.com/Misophonia Podcast. Theme music, as always, is by Moby. And until next week, wishing you peace and quiet.